All right, what's going on, everyone? Fourth episode of the Barbell Built Body YouTube channel series. Today we're going to be talking about building your bench. If you have a weak bench, if you have break down the movement at some point, going to discuss the three key areas where that might be happening and my best recommendations on how to fix that. So if your bench sucks, bench is weak, if you're having an issue, hopefully this video covers it. So let's dive right into it. 3 places where there could be an issue with your pressing or the actual muscles prime movers. So pectoralis major, anterior deltoid. However, I wouldn't say this is the number one issue, so weakness here is probably not leading to your bad press. If you're doing a lot of pressing movements, which oftentimes people are doing a lot of pressing movements. It's International Chest Day every day, right? But seriously, I don't think that's necessarily that wouldn't be my number one place to jump to of what's going on if my bench needs work. That wouldn't necessarily be my number one problem area. It could be, however, I wouldn't put it as my number one. The other two are where I think the issues lie. First of all, let's talk about scapular stability. You need to maintain that pressing position throughout the entirety of the movement. So if your chest is super developed, but you haven't worked and trained the back muscles to be able to withstand that pressing intensity, so keep the scapulas retracted, depressed, and downwardly rotated, so back here, pressing position, you're going to have either some protraction that could happen, some upward rotation, some elevation. So if your scapula is doing any of those weird things, we need to focus on what it is. So the pressing position, obviously opposite of what bench is, to work on those muscles is going to be rows. So, and we're going to talk about actions of scapula. When you're pressing, you don't want the scapula elevating, upwardly rotating, or protracting. So we need to focus on movements that do the opposite to strengthen the muscles that hold them retracted, depressed, downwardly rotated. Now, what are those muscles? Rhomboid major, rhomboid minor, middle and lower trapezius, pectoralis major, or pectoralis minor, and what else? I think that's it. So we need to train those. So how do we do that? This is where I think people make the mistake. They go big back, big bench. Yes, to an extent. It's not necessarily big back, big bench. It's strong back, big bench. Now, to do that, we need to, my best recommendation, heavy bent over rows. I'm a huge fan of bent over rows. I know people often hate them because they say it puts a lot of stress on your low back. So does deadlifting. If your back is bent, or if your hips are flexed and you're holding weight in your arms, there is torque on your low back. So if you have low back issues, obviously maybe you might need to modify and skip that exercise, but you should be doing some heavy pulling, basically opposite movement of the bench. Now, I like to either do, for bent over rows, barbell rows, I like to either do deadlift grip, which I think targets, it's a little bit closer, so it's going to be more elbow or shoulder extension. I think it targets the lats a little bit better versus wider, and I feel like I kind of get more horizontal abduction. So a little more posterior delt, and I feel like I have a little bit more of that, trying to keep that those scapulas retracted as they kind of protract and pull back as I pull up. Now, either of those are good variations. Big thing I see that people don't do is they don't go heavy enough. If you're benching super heavy, why would you only stay in low reps, 1, 3, 5 on bench? Why would you never go heavy rowing or in some sort of pulling exercise? I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not hating. I think that's great to use all. I think it's great to use all the rep ranges. So up to, 15, 20 reps. Maybe not so much for a heavy compound movement. I don't think I'd recommend 20 reps for barbell rows, but whatever movement you're doing, why wouldn't you row at the same, 3 reps, 5 reps, 8 reps? Stay in there sometimes. I think so. Heavy, people don't go heavy enough, I think, on these. They think of it solely as an assistant exercise. You should load barbell rows just like you're loading the bench press. Second, the other exercise I recommend for this is pull-ups. Now, why? Because the rhomboids both are there to, rhomboids, middle traps, lower traps, downwardly rotate the scapula, right? So your scapula is upwardly rotated, what's happening when it's coming down? It's downwardly rotating and it's pulling together. So this exercise works the muscles we need for the bench press to keep that scapular stability. Now, once again, nothing wrong with doing high reps with pull-ups, but you can also load this exercise. I throw on a backpack. If you want, you can use a dip belt, whatever, hang weights. I throw a backpack on, stack weights in there, and I do sets of 5 pull-ups just like I do sets of 5 on the bench, right? Because we're trying to train that back musculature to be able to hold everything tight together while I'm using my prime movers to press. So my back's not moving. Now, so don't be afraid to go heavy for those exercises. Now, that's training the back, so keep in mind your frequency and volume. Keep in mind what you're doing with your chest, how much you're training, the intensity of training, and what you're using for your back. There's a massive discrepancy. If you're having issues with protraction, so your shoulders kind of rolling forward, doing something weird, elevation, look at your back. Those are my recommendations for the 2 biggest exercises. Now, triceps, another weak point, lockout, especially if you do a closer grip bench, and that's your competition bench or your normal benching position. Now, I have my normal standard bench press position, which is about 1.5 times shoulder width. That just seems to be where I'm comfortable. I've gone a little bit wider, 2 at some points, but for the most part, I'm right about 1.5 shoulder width. Now, if your triceps are weak, your lockout's going to be weak, and sometimes even we see maybe a volunteer, especially on the weaker side, when you're not able to finish off the bench press, you kind of see maybe some elevation. So this might not necessarily be an issue with weakness of the back. It could be weakness of the triceps and kind of trying to get more leverage. If you see that, so that is one thing to note, is make sure possibly movement on one side might not necessarily be weakness in the back. It could be weakness of the triceps and kind of taking over the movement towards the end of the press. Now, best recommendation, once again, I think going heavy on close grip bench is a great idea. Nothing wrong with doing heavy sets of like 8. I don't really go much lower. I guess I do singles. However, usually that's still probably close to 75% of my max. But there's nothing wrong with really kind of pushing that, so you're really getting it's super close to your bench, right? So the same movement. So you're just hammering extra volume on the triceps. The other exercise I recommend personally, skull crushers. There's nothing wrong. Once again, 10 to up to 30 plus rep range. Actually, usually about 30 at the top. But mix those in. Don't always just go light. Push it. Once again, the triceps are a single joint with the exception of the long head, which passes the shoulder joint too. So you don't need to load them quite as heavy, but still don't just always go for a pump, right? You need to understand if you're working to get max strength out of your triceps, you need to still hit lower rep ranges. I wouldn't really go below 8 or 10, but you should be pushing it during that time, not just looking for a pump. I hope these tips were helpful. If you have any questions or more in depth, have questions about some issues that are arising in your bench press, I'd love to answer them. Drop them in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will look forward to seeing you guys in 2 more weeks with the next video. Talk to you soon.